Thank you so much. Hello, everybody, everywhere. I hope you are doing well and taking good care of yourselves. I'm so glad you are here joining me today. I work to implement the strategies of Oregon's 2050 vision for materials management, and my primary focus is on helping businesses produce and consume materials more sustainably. And this year, one of my main projects is administering an internship program which has been a very rewarding during this very odd year. I've had the opportunity to live and work in 4 different states at environmental agencies and nonprofits to implement environmental regulations and policies for the last 15 years, which has given me a broad perspective on states' capabilities to prevent pollution and enforce environmental rules. So I'm very honored to be here with you today to talk about chemicals in food packaging from a state government perspective. First, I will describe the federal regulatory scenario that states encounter when working on toxic chemicals in food contact materials. Then I will explain how states' environmental regulations address pollutants and finish with how states are finding pathways to ban or reduce the use of these toxic chemicals. To better how the US approaches regulating toxic chemicals and products, I will focus on PFAS, so thank you, Ian, for that great introduction, as it has been a recent priority of national activities. And this pathway is very common on how most environmental regulations, excuse me, are addressed. Okay, oops. Okay, to start at the federal level, there are 2 primary agencies whose mission and activities support food packaging research and policy: the Environmental Protection Agency and the Food and Drug Administration. We'll start with the FDA, as it is an agency within the Federal Department of Health and Human Services, who is responsible for protecting public health. Let's see. The FDA administers many programs, including their food division, who address PFAS in packaging. And since the 1960s, they've authorized several broad classes of PFAS for use in food contact substances, including food packaging. In addition, this department reviews many new science for use in food contact applications, and also are responsible for compliance assurance. State health departments that administer the federal and human health service programs receive funding for priority activities. And in Oregon, at least, the health authority does not prioritize work on hazardous substances in food packaging, but like many other states like Washington and California, work closely with the state environmental agencies to evaluate the concerns, coordinate messaging, and provide other types of support. So back to the second federal agency, the EPA, whose mission is to protect human health and the environment. The EPA sets national standards and designates authority directly to individual states to implement the environmental laws. The EPA supports research of fluorinated compounds in food packaging in coordination with the FDA, has developed a significant new use rule for some PFAS, and under the Toxic Substance Control Act are evaluating other hazard chemicals in food packaging. So EPA designates authority to the individual states to implement the environmental laws except for the TSCA Act, or the Toxic Substance Control Act. The Clean Air and Water Acts are basically designed to identify pollutants, analyze how much of these pollutants can be released into the air and water without causing harm to humans, and then regulate the release of these pollutants based on the accepted pollutant load. The majority of the land-based rules are focused on cleaning up past pollution and tracking and reporting the amount of hazardous or toxic chemicals used, stored, or disposed of on the land. These rules do not prohibit or limit or require controls for the use of storage or hazardous or toxic chemicals, nor do they typically address toxic chemicals bound in the product. In most cases, pollutants of concern and pollutants must be identified as a regulated pollutant with standards of acceptable releases to the environment or cleanup parameters. An additional layer exists, as I mentioned earlier, that when these chemicals are used up in the process or contained in a product or material, they're not emitted to the environment during the manufacturing at the point source. Many state environmental agencies do not have the authority to regulate them. A recent exception that you may have seen is with firefighting foam. So why are we seeing all of these policies and regulations banning firefighting foam containing PFAS? It's a product, right? Yes, but the foam is released to a storm water system that flows directly to water bodies, possibly drinking water sources, which has a regulatory system through the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permitting program. Plus, it can be directly linked to an event that is conducted oftentimes by a government, like a municipal fire department. So there is some regulatory wiggle room for some materials containing toxic chemicals. So most states have focused on taking action to address PFAS, very limited to PFOA and PFOS, by focusing on their known regulatory authority and pathways, specifically connected to drinking water. They are collecting data to determine if water quality criteria can be developed, setting standards for cleanup, and regulating how the chemical is being disposed of. So I wanted to expound on all of these activities to illustrate that the current regulatory system is allocating a lot of time and resources to their own current pathways, which focus on data collection, conducting elaborate assessments, evaluating the viability of developing criteria, and all of these activities take a lot of time and are very cost intensive. And these activities are typically focused on the emissions or the discharges and not addressing the source of the chemical bound in the product or preventing it, even though we know right now the concerns with PFAS in food packaging. Fortunately, many states have found ways to respond to these concerns and have been able to prioritize PFAS in food packaging, and they are taking independent action by proposing new regulatory authority, while the FDA and the US EPA and other national health agencies struggle with the next steps. In the last few years, several states have passed regulations that banned toxic chemicals in food packaging, some under their current rules like California's Green Chemistry Safer Consumer Product Laws, or passed entirely new rules like Washington State's Safer Products for Washington. And many others have proposed new regulatory authority to reduce or ban toxics. Thankfully, the organization Safer States is tracking this information for all of us. So of those listed, I wanted to briefly highlight two who have addressed food packaging through laws. Washington State on the West Coast, which I worked for a few years, and Iowa, which is right in the middle of the country where my parents lived for several years. We know a lot about Washington's journey to pass their Safer Products rule, and some key observations I see that are different from other states include a very educated legislature, active nonprofits and advocacy groups who coordinate with state agency staff, a strong culture to protect the Puget Sound, and just months before the law was passed, the world learned about an orca mother who carried her dead newborn on her nose for 17 days in the Puget Sound, which became a call for action. Moving to Iowa, a politically conservative and less populated state, still moved a bill forward because it was brought forth by a senator who works at the University of Iowa in their environmental research department. He had discussed concern and shared their research with the Natural Resource Department before introducing the bill, but generally staff at the Natural Resource Department were very surprised to see the bill introduced. And in the end, it did not receive the votes to pass. Both places had the available science, but I think Washington State was successful because residents have a strong connection and concern with the health of one's community, active community partners, and coordination amongst all stakeholders. When a state can't get enough momentum to pass a law, staff have found other mechanisms through purchasing policy and governor's orders, which give permission to staff to set up collaborative activities between government and business, disallow purchases, require disclosure of a product, ingredients, and more. These actions, which are time intensive to track nationally and difficult to show compliance assurance, show that their region is aware of the issues, are ready to support a national initiative, and can prompt businesses to act voluntarily. Other very important factors that you've learned about already is the work through Mind the Store campaign, who tested packaging and broadly disseminated the results. And now many food retailers have committed to eliminate PFAS. These commitments were not likely taken solely because of these regulations and policies, but in tandem with the extensive work from the campaigns. Finally, I wanted to point out from my own perspective that I've been starkly reminded how important it is to focus on the elimination of classes of toxic chemicals in products and processes, because people don't always make the healthiest choice. Right here in Oregon, we had several days of fires and smoke. The air was just beyond hazardous. And I witnessed numerous people outside on a regular basis, walking around, riding their bikes, and even smoking cigarettes, despite the known health concerns. So just to wrap up in a few closing takeaways, state environmental agencies are taking action to address chemicals through current regulatory mechanisms, and many are taking actions aside from federal agencies to ban food contact materials containing PFAS. Materials and products are a major source of pollution, yet our current environmental regulations focus on the smokestack or point source and aren't effectively addressing chemicals as a class. People will not make the healthiest choice, and at all levels, we must take action together for effective change. Thank you so much to the Food Packaging Forum staff who encourage and facilitate collaboration. And thank you to all of you here today. We are all working together to support the elimination of toxics in food contact material so we can all live well.